appreciate being asked. Wayne and I both struggled over this lesson because it's supposed to be the faith in the face of fatherhood, and yet these two chapters that we're to go from, David's faith had faltered, and so we would need to learn some lessons from this because the Christian life goes up and down. I mean, now he was not a Christian, and he was still just part of God's family under the Old Testament, and a very strong man there, and a very strong leader and example in their faith, but yet not everybody remembers that we need to pray about what we do, and anytime we forget to do that, we're going to make worldly decisions instead of spiritual decisions. David is one of my favorite Bible characters, and probably yours too. His background, remember, he was a shepherd boy. It's been brought out in previous lessons ahead of this, that he was able to be very fierce when something would try to take his sheep away, because any shepherd was supposed to be responsible for those sheep. And so he killed the lion and the bear, and then we saw he killed Goliath. Remember, he was the composer of songs with his lyre, and was very, they said, cunning on that. He played it really well, and was one that had to be called in front of King Saul to calm his rages, because music does soothe us, or it can hype us up and energize us, depending upon the type it is. Remember, this morning we had a lesson about his friendship with Prince Jonathan. And he was an ancestor in the lineage of Jesus when Jesus was brought to earth. And his throne of David, when he became the king, that was synonymous with what Jesus was going to sit on David's throne. Not literally, although there are people in the denominational world who really think he's going to come back and sit on the actual throne. Well, it's not even there now. He was a man after God's own heart. From 1 Samuel 13, when God was going to reject Saul, he said, "I'm rejecting Saul, and he was seeking after a man after his own heart." So he wanted somebody that would be like him, like God. At his anointing, all of his brothers were rejected from the eldest, and then they thought, well, Samuel said, "Do you not have any more sons?" Because God had said it's going to be from one of Jesse's sons. He said, "Oh, there's just another one. He's out in the field with the sheep. Bring him in because I want to talk to him." And then he realized he was the one that he was to anoint, because he was the one after God's own heart. Imagine writing the Psalms and looking up at the sky at night. And we have so much artificial light. We don't see the stars like the patriarchs did. They saw the stars in all their glory. When we were having the Perseid meteor showers back in August, we had to drive farther out into the mountains to be able to look up and see a beautiful star-studded sky. And we realized what looked like clouds up there. I almost forgotten what the Milky Way was supposed to look like. It was supposed to be so many stars clustered together that it would look like a milky sky, and that's what it looked like. But see, he saw all of these things. Now, when he was out there with the stars, with the sheep, he had time to compose this music. Some of the things that he wrote apparently were, like it was brought out this morning, those things mirrored what was happening in his life. Whatever we're going through, whatever challenge we have, those are things that are going to be on our heart. There's going to be on our mind a lot. When Samuel was ready to anoint David, he said, "Man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart." There are women who really feel like, "Oh, if I just looked more beautiful, that person looks like the epitome of beauty." I saw one of our girls that has finished school, and she was writing something that I saw on Facebook. She was saying, sometimes you just feel like there's this beauty of perfection, and you think, I don't look like that. But our beauty comes from inside. The women I remember from my childhood who were the most beautiful to me, it's because they had a beautiful heart, and it radiated from them. Now, David was also always repentant. There were things that he did that were not right because he was human, just like us. But he was always repentant. After the death of Uriah, that he tried to cover up the sin of his adultery with Bathsheba, then he had her husband killed, tried to get her husband to come home from the war, sleep at home. That was his cover. Like maybe he'll think that he made her pregnant and cover that up. Well, God doesn't let us cover up our sins. So the prophet Nathan had related a story to David and said there was this man that had this little lamb, and somebody else took it. And so as he told this story, David became enraged at that story, like, the perpetrator of this. And Nathan said, "You are the man." Because David had many, many wives, and he had concubines. Can you imagine? We're going to have to ask God someday, why did you want men to be so oversexed? Because this is a problem in so many marriages and relationships. But this was a story where there was a consequence that happened after he had the affair with Bathsheba. Somebody had to bring her in there. So things like this, whenever we sin, it's very rare that our sin does not affect somebody else. Maybe it's a word that we say. Maybe it's an action we do. Maybe an attitude we show. Or just an overt sin. Somebody else is going to know about it. So it's going to affect them. Well, there were consequences because God took the life of their little baby. David had hoped and prayed that baby would live, and the baby did not live because God could not leave that consequence. We could not leave that where this would be a reminder to everyone. After the baby had died, he fasted and he prayed during that time, and then when he realized that servants were whispering, and they were just afraid to tell him the baby did not live. And so then he said, "Has the baby died?" And then he got up and he cleaned up, and then he ate. And before that he was fasting, not cleaning himself up. And so here's what he said, and this may be brought out in another lesson, but I think it is so important. He said, "He cannot come to me, but I can go to him." And so in that we see just a glimpse of his belief in eternal life. That sometimes we wonder, well, did they realize in Old Testament days that heaven is coming someday, that we're going to be in heaven? They had some vague notion that they'd be gathered to Abraham's bosom, or they would be gathered to someone in their family this way. David did have failures, and these two chapters are going to cover that. He had multiplied wives and concubines, and yet in the Old Testament they were told, do not go after women from foreign countries. Don't bring them into your household. Don't give your daughters to them in marriage, because if they did, now sometimes people would say you're diluting the gene pool, but what they were doing is they were bringing in other concepts that were foreign to God's people, and he did not want that. So,
can I ask a question?
Yes.
What is I really don't understand the difference between a concubine and a wife.
A concubine apparently would be just like a sex slave. Does that sound right to y'all? That they were not married, but yet they were kind of officially part of his harem in a sense. We think about Arab sultans having harems, long ago, but apparently this happened, in these kingdoms also. This way, now with having multiple wives, multiple children, they would be living in different households. Now, if you've ever seen anything like Sister Wives, which I don't watch that stuff, it's trash, but I've seen the advertisements for it, where they would have the same husband and he'd go from house to house to house and take care of everybody that way. You might say, well, you're going to have different wives raising those children. And he would be not a hands-on father, but he'd be a visiting father, you might say. Now, as we open the story here, we're going to see that one of the brothers is lustfully admiring his half-sister. This would be incest if it was carried out. And he decided, I'm just so lovesick over Tamar. She's so beautiful. I just want her so much. So he had a cousin who facilitated it for him and said, well, here's what you do. Why don't you pretend to be sick? And why don't you just ask your dad when he comes to see you, ask him, can you have Tamar come over to my house and just fix some food for me and give it to me there? And so David was unwittingly providing that opportunity. So when Tamar got there, he said, well, let's come into the bedroom here. And then he pulled her into bed and said, come lie with me. And she said, no, that would not be right. We can't do that. And she said, I know that if you ask for King David's hand, my hand in marriage, he would give me to you. But he took her forcefully, basically raped her, and then, as much as he thought he loved her, which was his infatuation, he just threw her away and said, get out of here, and told the servants, take her out of here. Meanwhile, it had all the servants leave, so they were alone, and then he had some servant come get her. Well, she was just so upset because here she'd been violated. She had not been accepted as somebody that, that he loved, and she was just thrown away. So she was basically ruined as a woman in their culture. And so she ripped her long sleeve garment that she was wearing, her princess outfit, kind of a robe, ripped it and put her hand on her head, showing she was in shame and agony. And she ran to her brother's house. Now she and Absalom were full brother and sister. And this was Amnon who had raped her. But now we see that they were young adults. They were not children. And that's going to be a key part in our talk about David and all this. Now, I wonder why David did not connect with everything and why he did not discipline his children. The commentator that I was reading was suggesting that three of David's songs may have been written during this time when he was having to deal with all of these issues. He suggested that it might be Psalms 39, 41, and 55. And he might have been in bad health. Now, if we are in bad health and advancing in age, we may not make as good a decisions as we did when we were younger. And then later on, even now, after my chapters, it's going to be where that we're going to see that later on when Absalom absolutely takes over the throne, he's going to come in terrible rebellion from all this. But anyway, David's going to fail to protect his troops during this. Okay, now 2 Samuel, chapters 13 and 14, where we are, covers just another difficult period of David's life. He had lots of difficulties. Can you imagine somebody trying to throw a spear at you? Somebody chasing you down, hunting for you among all the caves and things. David went through a lot because of King Saul and others. Now, at the time that he had this sin with Bathsheba, before these events happened with his children, he was told, the sword will not depart from your household. Now, the sword is just a euphemism for death in the family. Now, nowadays, we probably wouldn't have swords that would kill us. We'd have guns or some other kind of thing that would happen here. But this is what he was told when King David had this sin with Bathsheba. This was going to be a consequence. Every sin we have has some kind of a consequence. Every good choice we make has a consequence. I used to be a school teacher, and I would tell the kids, I said, there are consequences from whatever you choose to do. And I'd have good consequences, I'd have bad consequences. And so, if you do really good, now here's what happens here. And if you do some things that you shouldn't do and you've been warned, here's what happens here. Chapter 13 opens with that incest, where that oldest son was, we think he was the oldest anyway, was attracted to the half-sister. He was very, had the infatuation. Jonadab was the cousin who gave him the bad advice and tricked David into allowing Tamar to come over there. David trusted Amnon and he consented to the visit. But then Amnon seduced her. She protested, but he forced her. And Amnon was a very bad guy. That's a key to remember with all this. Anybody who wants to rape his sister is not a good guy. Okay, that's going to be a key there. All right, when Tamar fled, she fled to Absalom, her full brother, and Absalom said, don't worry about this. I'll take care of it, basically. But he said, don't take it to heart. In other words, just try not to say anything. What he did was he plotted vengeance for 2 years. Have you heard the statement that a lot of people say now, vengeance is best served cold? That's a worldly thought. I've heard of that. And I thought that's exactly what he did. He waited and he waited. He didn't confront his brother that had raped the sister. He waited. And so meanwhile, King David heard about this and was upset, but he did nothing about it. Now, in their law, somebody who did something like this should have been punished. But David didn't do anything. And David had the whole kingdom to run, I realize that. But he didn't do anything.
Is Absalom the one that had the huge hair?
Well, that's coming up. Okay, yeah.
Huge curly hair.
Okay, yeah, that is the one here. Okay, now the story's going to get even worse because Absalom, this really, really beautiful guy, decided he was going to plan a family celebration. And he thought, okay, I'm going to ask my dad to come and bring all his servants because, you've heard of harvest celebrations this time of year, where people do things like this when they have an ingathering of the new fruits and vegetables and all this, and they do a harvest celebration. Well, these were shepherds, and so when they do the sheep sharing, they do the same kind of thing. They would, do a celebration. So he thought, I'll ask my dad, the king, to come and bring his servants. And of course, that would be a big entourage and make it very hard. So King David, said no. He refused to come and said, no, I think that'd be too hard on you. And so then Absalom said, well, then let all my brothers come, all the king's sons come. So when he asked him two different things, he was getting what he wanted because I think he thought he would have the refusal and then he would have this one. And so he brought them. And then he ordered his servants. Absalom ordered his servants. Now when I give the word, you strike Amnon down and you kill him. And he said, now you be brave and valiant. Can you imagine telling somebody to be brave and valiant? That's something you'd say to somebody before they go to war. But here's where they were going to go to commit murder. So all the king's sons fled for their lives because they didn't know what this was, a dynasty coup, and they would all be wiped out so that Absalom would have the throne. He'd be next in line that way. So they all fled. King David received the report, but it was a false report because he heard that all the sons had been killed. And so he was mourning, and their way of doing things was to rip their clothes, just to grab their clothes and just rip them. So he and all of his servants were doing that. And then Jonadab, remember, he's the one that gave the bad advice, like you could pretend to be sick and you could give it that way. The nephew the nephew of David who had given the bad advice to Amnon said, no, only Amnon was killed. Trust me in that. So meanwhile, Absalom fled to Geshur, that's another country, his mother's homeland. His mother was the daughter of the king. So not only did he have a father who was a king, he had a grandfather who was a king. And he was stayed away for 3 years. Okay, he was apparently pleased there, but David longed to see him. Now Absalom was such a handsome man. The Bible describes him as being handsome from the sole of his foot to the top of his head. And he is the one who had that beautiful head of hair. And later on, that's going to get caught in the tree. His hair's going to get caught, hair here. But he would cut his hair once a year, and then he would weigh the hair, And how many people do that? Most people don't weigh their hair. Now, some girls grow long hair, and then they cut it for locks of love or something similar to have wigs made for children that don't have hair. But here he was, that he was so proud of himself. He recognized outer beauty. And it was easy for the people in their country to think, oh, look at Absalom. Isn't he gorgeous? Isn't he handsome? And apparently, when he had his own children, he had a beautiful daughter the same way. It sounds as though that their mother must have been very beautiful to pass the genetics down this way, just really pretty. And this is a strange part. Several things in these 2 chapters seem very strange and hard to figure out. David longed to see Absalom, but it said that he was comforted that Amnon was killed. Now, doesn't that seem strange? Because he said, and so Wayne and I discussed that, was he comforted because time has passed now and he's gotten over this now with his sons dying? Or was he feeling like, well, finally, justice has been done, I didn't have to do it? This is hard to tell. It's kind of a strange and unclear situation. Now, both Amnon and Absalom had bad character, because when you think about rape, you think about incest, you think about murder, you think about treachery. All of those are bad characteristics. Now, chapter 14, we go into another section here, and here's another thing that's very unusual. We wondered, why did we get these topics? These are hard. But chapter 14 it opens with the wise woman of Tekoa, Tekoa. Tekoa is another area, and apparently this woman had worldly wisdom. Now, there's a man named Joab who was the captain of David's army, and he was very, very cunning. He was He was sly and he tried to trick everybody here. He was using worldly wisdom, and so he chose that woman to come, and he put words into her mouth. He recruited her and told her what to say to King David. So because he wanted Absalom to come back there, and he had questionable motives. By Old Testament law, Absalom should have been killed because what he committed was murder. It wasn't manslaughter where it was accidental death or anything like that. It was out and out murder. Well, the woman came pretending to be a mourner, pleading for the king's help. Now, she pretended to have, gone through several days of mourning. And, when you're mourning, you don't look, you just don't feel like getting yourself dressed up and looking good. So she came looking pretty awful. And she pretended to be a widow who had lost one son, and she only had two. She pretended to be the mother of two sons who had argued out in the field. Kind of sounds like Cain and Abel to me, the same kind of thing. And she said her family rose up against her because this one son killed the other one. And so their law was that if somebody had killed somebody else, you're supposed to turn them in, or they have to flee to a city of refuge. They had 7 of them in the Old Testament days. 3, there were different sides of the River Jordan. And that way they could get there, and if they had done an accidental killing, they were supposed to be able to be protected by the high priest and had to stay there as long as he was in charge there all his life. And then she said her family rose up against her to hand over that living son. But she said, but that would have ended her husband's bloodline and his land ownership. And it's another one of their obscure laws, but it was such that God had planned for none of their family names to be wiped out in Israel. That if somebody lost her husband, then the next brother would take her and raise children in the brother's name. And if he died, another one. And this was one of the things that the Pharisees and Sadducees were asking Jesus about. In fact, it was the Sadducees, because they don't believe in a resurrection. And they were saying, Jesus, now, let me tell you the story. Now, who would be the one that would be her husband in eternity? And he said, you don't understand. In eternity, we're not married, we're not given in marriage. But it goes back to that same story. So there was supposed to be where the avenger of blood in the family could come and kill that one who did the manslaughter unless he fled to that city. So then when King David was agreeing with her, then she said, well, then why don't you bring back your son? And see, the whole thing was so that Absalom could come back. They were trying to manipulate David into saying yes, that he should come back. So David asked her, he said, is Joab behind this? And she said, yes, he told me everything to say. So Joab is a manipulator, and we're going to talk about that later about this. Okay, Joab was called in by David, and he prostrated himself before David. And we will see that this is what people would do when they would come to the king's throne. They wouldn't just come in unannounced and say, here, I'm here, or even knock on the door. They would have to be presented, but if they were not invited by that king, they could be put to death. So when Joab came in, he prostrated himself with his face to the ground in front of David. And then David said, yes, go back to Geshur and bring Absalom back to Jerusalem. But David refused to see Absalom for 2 more years after he was back then. David did not ask the Lord, is this what I should do? This is the downfall. If we don't ask the Lord, or if we don't seek God's word through the Bible here, then we are in trouble. If we're just using man's wisdom or our own wisdom, we're in trouble here. Well, the story involved those inheritance laws, but it didn't really apply to Absalom. Yet he agreed, and David kept his promise. And the family lands were supposed to stay in the family. So when Absalom was recalled, he was so beautiful and so appealing that everybody just loved him. So this may be one of the reasons why they felt like he should come back, because people in the community in their kingdom loved him. Okay, then Absalom sent for Joab after he had been 2 years, or was it 3 years, in the city, and he still hadn't seen his father. He apparently was under house arrest. And you're house arrest, you go back to your house, you stay there, you don't get out. That sort of thing. And so he sent twice to ask Joab, this king of the head of the army, why I want to go to David. I want to go see my dad. I want to go to the throne. And he was ignored. So he retaliated. A person who would murder his own brother would retaliate. So here's what he did. He had a field next to the field that belonged to Joab, the head of the army. And so he told his servants, go set that field on fire. Well, it was barley season, so he burned up the barley crop. Now Joab came and said, okay, why did you do that? Why did you authorize that? And he said, and so he said, I want to go see King David. Okay, he preferred to it. He said, I should have just stayed in Geshur. I liked it better there. And he was putting a challenge to the king to set him free or put him to death. Now, he deserved death, didn't he? But with his pride and arrogance, he thought, what did I do wrong? You see people like this today that they can do something really wrong, but in their own minds, they have not done anything wrong. Well, chapter 14 is going to end with David calling for Absalom. And Absalom is going to humble himself and bow to face down to the ground in front of his father. And King David kissed Absalom. You know, no matter how long our children may have been away, we're parents and we want to see them. So he was glad to see him in spite of the pride and treachery. And that's where chapter 14 ends. So there will be more on this from one of the other lessons about what's going to happen with Absalom's rebellion, because it's going to start out with him hiring a chariot and having 50 runners run ahead of the chariot. So he's, in a sense, saying, look at me, because I'm the prince. And he's going to be getting ready to steal the kingdom from David. Now, there's some lessons and applications here for us. God forgives us when we sin and ask for forgiveness, but we still have to suffer the consequences. Remember that God had said the sword shall not depart from David's house, and then look at the calamities that happened here. There's a principle that you might want to, if you're taking notes, you might want to write down. Sin will take us farther than we intended to go, and it will keep us longer, and I can repeat this for you, it'll keep us longer than we intended to stay, and will cost us more than we intended to pay. I'll repeat that. Sin will take us farther than we wanted to go, and will keep us longer than we intended to stay, and will cost us more than we intended to pay. And that is the way things happen. The next thing I would say is that it's dangerous to marry outside of God's laws, because God is trying to keep unholy influences away from us. I'm reminding one of our ladies in our congregation who is a widow. She's been a widow for about 5 years, and she's basically engaged to a man who will not come to church with her. He has been there a few times, but he decided church isn't for me. She's still planning to marry him, and I said, please be thinking about this. If he won't even come to church with you, is this good? And when she thought she was going to marry him sooner, she moved him into her house. And I thought, oh boy, does that ever set up temptation? She keeps saying, nothing's going on. Ladies, I'm 73. I've seen a lot of life. And if you want to marry somebody, that's putting yourself in a bad position. Even if you say there's nothing going on, what does it look like to neighbors? And she said, well, it must look terrible. But we both tried to talk to her. Other people have. But, you know, I just hope if I ever get into a situation where people see that I am not living right, that they will tell me. I mean, like this was mentioned in one of the sermons this morning. If you love me enough, talk to me about it, because we can all slip into sin, okay? Now,
Weezie.
I'm sorry?
I knew I had a friend in San Antonio, Texas, whose parents had become, well, the mother had become a Christian after she was born, but her father refused to become a Christian. And for 10 long years, she always would pray that she could invite her husband to go to services and have a study. And for 10 long years, he would sit behind a newspaper, wouldn't bother to get dressed, and would be reading his newspaper and saying, no, thank you. every Lord's Day morning for 10 years. And this is a true story because her name's the same as mine, Maureen. So, but anyways, then she decided she had spent 10 years doing this, and she felt like that's pretty long. So then she didn't ask this Lord's Day for him to go to services with her, and he had the newspaper up, and she said, "Oh, goodbye, I'm leaving," and he said, "Aren't you going to ask me?" And she said, "Ask you what?" "Ask me to go." He said, "Well, I changed my mind this week, I'm not going to ask you." But he said, "Well, I'm going to go anyways," and he was all dressed in a suit. And he went, and he studied with the minister for quite a few weeks, and then he was immersed into Christ.
Wonderful.
So both parents became Christians.
And we're told in the New Testament, it's not going to be our lectures to an unfaithful husband. It's going to be the way we live our life that will
Just
make him
that
see.
gentle asking,
Yeah. Well, see, now Wayne baptized his own father, so I know there are stories like that. But I think that we need to be very cautious, though, if we're marrying somebody who's not a Christian, because not all of them will obey, and if they don't, they may pull us down. Now, my dad was not a Christian when Mother married him. She was a new Christian, and they had a rural mail carrier, back when you could put a note in your mailbox without a stamp on it. And so he was an elder in the church, and so he would answer their Bible questions. And so he was, in a sense, he was studying with them that way, and the dad became a Christian. And in a gathering, when I guess I was a teenager, there were several men at a gathering in a house, and all of them had been taught by their wives. So I know that there are situations where, yes, they will obey, but it's a dangerous situation, So I really encourage people not to marry outside the faith. David's marriages many times were political alliances, like the king's daughter from Geshur. But it also became sexual because they had children together. And the wives, were having their own places. One thing I did, I tried to make a list of all of David's wives and all of his children. And I'm not even sure how I got them all. It's amazing because remember he had Michal, who was Saul's daughter, that was brought out this morning.
That's the other one.
And then they didn't have children because he didn't like the way she was criticizing him when the ark was brought back into town, right back to the place. And so he was dancing around with other people, and she thought, you're that's indignified. And so he said, I'm through with you, and you won't have any children, And then there was Ahinoam, something like that, the Jezreelite. Then there was Abigail, who was the widow of Nabal. There was Bathsheba. And there was, it says, more sons and daughters were born to him after he went to after the kingdom started in Jerusalem then, and he had many wives and concubines then. So, and there's a whole list I have of some of his children here. So, that spells trouble, because I know in our own family, our extended family, my brother and his wife have been married each other. This is their third marriage for both of them. It's not the right relationship. And if they'd been married to each other first, that would be wonderful. But together they have 6 kids. And so one time I asked my brother about who all was coming for this family celebration. He said, just the ones who are still speaking to us. And that's what happens, because they get in the ins and outs because of the things that happen in the family now. Now, here's another principle that you might want to write down. What parents excuse in moderation, their children may take to excess. I'll repeat that. What parents excuse in moderation, their children may take to excess. Nowadays we hear a lot of people with, they think it's okay to social drink because they think, Jesus turned water into wine. Did you know that was grape juice? It was not intoxicating wine because that was the best wine there. Okay, their children may wind up as alcoholics, because it just takes one taste and that's all they need to go further with it. Some people may think, I live in a state where marijuana is legal now. And they may think, it's not going to hurt me just to smoke this little bit or have this little bit. But their children may become drug addicts because they've seen this tolerated, so they may take it to excess. What about people who flirt a lot? Then they may have a divorce. There may be sinful partying that goes on, and then you may have a lot of immorality with that. We have seen all of this playing out very recently, and I don't even know how the vote came out yet today, but in our national news. Remember, our Supreme Court Justice nominee, Brett Kavanaugh, there's been a lot of controversy because of teenage drinking and parties. And they've tried to, one side says one thing, one side says another. What we can do is leave ourselves open to attack from Satan or to attack from criticism from other people. There is nobody that can't be criticized. Nobody. I mean, somebody may just not like the way you part your hair or the way, your choice of clothing style. Whatever it is, wherever you choose to live, somebody's going to be there to criticize you. Remember, though, good can come with the bad. This is another key point here. This has brought about greater discussion about the dangers of alcohol and the dangers of what we do when we're young. It's been brought about a greater discussion about sexual temptations. Our oldest granddaughter, I mentioned, has just started to School of Mines, and there's some things I don't like about the college campuses now. They have co-ed dorms, which means your room may be right next to a guy's room, or they may be right across the hall from you. I said, keep your door locked at night. And I've been telling her, and the things I've prayed for have all come true. But I said, I've prayed for you to have roommates with high standards, with godly attitudes. And so they were able to choose each other. She has to have 3 together in a room because they have so many now, the new incoming class. But these girls are good. They have good morals. And then I'd also pray that she would get to be part of a congregation that would have a college-age group. I was thinking about Bear Valley, but that would have been where her parents had to leave a car for her on the weekends, where she could drive over to Bear Valley, to go to worship there. Well, I found out that there was a recently graduated couple that they had lived in Longmont, which was maybe a couple of hours away from Denver. His dad was one of the elders there. They had met in high school. They both went to School of Mines, graduated as engineers, and they're working with college age and working a little bit on the campus and offering rides for the students. They come and pick her up every Sunday. And then he leads the Bible class. And so I'm so happy about this. And they're getting her involved in things where they're doing work projects and things. So I've told her, I said, never underestimate the power of your Grammy's prayers, because everything I've been praying for her, it's been coming out just right. Even one day when she had made an appointment with the doctor, that she has dermatology problems, and so she has to get a blood test a few days before she goes in and has her appointment. So the blood test worked out fine the way her schedule was at lunchtime. Well, this next one, we got to our appointment early, and they took her late. And so I had her driving so we could make all the time. It wouldn't be my fault if we were a little bit late that way. And we got back to campus maybe 3 minutes late. And she was going to have to hoof it across campus, as fast as she could go. She said she power walked till her calves were burning, her legs were burning. But she said she did her 5-minute walk in 3 minutes. And she got into the class, and they had not taken roll yet. So even though she walked in a minute late, she was not considered tardy. And I said, your granny prayed everything's going to work out for you. I said, always remember that. So I said, good can come with the bad. And so it's given me a chance to tell her to be really careful, stay away from the frat houses, that nothing good happens there, stay away from these certain things there. And I think that another thing that has come out with these things, with these hearings and all the discussion, in the news and among people, has been that Christian voices can be a voice of reason, or if we make the wrong choice, we can choose to dishonor the name by, lashing out at people and not being nice. So they really watch to see how we react and if we're being nice about things. Okay, here's another point that I think is another thing for us to remember from this, is that if we fail to discipline our children at any age, that we are going to be doing something that leaves them open to temptation and leaves us responsible. Sometimes parents of young children will say, I just love them too much to discipline them. No, if you love your children, you will teach them right from wrong, and you will pull them back from things that are wrong. We might have that problem when they're a teen. We might think, but I can't reason with them. They're not going to listen. We need to do that. These were young adults, and David did not intervene. He did not take charge here. Now, one of the things that we see with Eli back in an earlier time was that God took away his position because he said, you failed to discipline your sons. Well, his sons were adults and they were working as priests, but they were taking away the sacrifices from people, and they were even being sexually immoral with some of the women that came there. So, these were adults, and yet, they were still, Eli was still held responsible. And the lesson to me is, yes, it's hard when your kids are grown up. And yes, it's hard, and we don't have a lot of influence over them. But if we say nothing, what does silence give? Consent. Silence gives consent. We have a situation, and some of you others have had situations in your families too, where your children tend to prefer to go into sin, and they try to think that, oh, there's nothing wrong with this. This is the way I was made, or this is fine. I studied the scriptures, and we're just going to disagree. But we still have the responsibility to teach them and to try to teach them the dangers of what they're doing. I was doing that with our daughter this last week. We've been dealing with her homosexuality for at least 19 years that we've known of. We didn't know about it before that. She left a marriage. She decided that she was attracted, same-sex attraction to a woman at work. And so she decided that she would just divorce her husband. They had bought the house next door to us. And we had gone on a mission trip to be gone a whole month. We came back to Columbine Massacre High School the same weekend that we found out about her. We came back in, we got the news about the Columbine killings before we even got back to the United States. But we got the letter from her through our son after we got back. And so I could openly grieve and weep. I was weeping for my daughter's soul, and other people in the neighborhood, the community probably thought I was just grieving for those poor children who, those poor teenagers that were killed. There is a difference between discipline and punishment, and a lot of times people think, oh, I can't punish them. Well, punishment is where you're looking backward at what they did, and it's kind of like you're spanking them or hurting them because what they did. Whereas discipline is teaching them in the future, do not do this. Here's why I don't want you to do this. And so there's a difference between punishment and discipline. There's another principle. If we sow to the wind, we will reap the whirlwind. And so, if we pretend that you're out there like they used to do, sowing the seeds, that have a bag full of seeds and then scatter it. Well, if you're doing it out in the wind, what's going to happen? It's going to blow all around you. And so that was a principle there. The last thing I would say is don't be gullible. Don't believe everything you hear. When we were looking at David's life, he was gullible to Amnon, to Absalom, to the woman of Tekoa, and also to Joab. All of them tried to manipulate him. He was the sovereign ruler. He could have said no. And because he did not ask God, what should I do about this? Then that's when they were able to trick him. And not everybody who we would listen to gives a good advice. Sometimes it's worldly advice. Like that woman of Tekoa was known as the wise woman of Tekoa. She was using worldly wisdom, not godly wisdom. We need to be careful about that, because when the first person tells their story, they can say, oh yeah, we want to agree with that. But when we hear the other side of it, we think, oh no. As one of our teachers, John Moore, who's one of our teachers that comes in and out through Bear Valley, has said, he teaches a lot of counseling classes, and he has a master's in that. He said, there's always two sides to every pancake. And so, then you think about that whatever you hear or whatever you see, there may be another side that has a lot of validity to it, and it might be the better side. And the way I usually say it is, if somebody has a personal problem, interpersonal problem with somebody else, there's probably three sides. Because if Wayne and I were having an argument, he would see his side, I would see my side more clearly, but God is going to see both sides, and he's going to know what is right and wrong there. So this is my conclusion for you. Let's pray for all Christian families, and let's be like David in his better times when he inquired of the Lord, because there are consequences if we don't. And that is your lesson.
Thank you.